for those of you who are not here, I wanted to just once again talk, oh, so very briefly about the spelling of the word. And the spelling of the word in this case is not is not a minor issue. It first came up, as I mentioned, when I took an anti-Semitism course with Professor Michael Meyer, a wonderful teacher still around at the Hebrew Union College. And at the time, I didn't understand what he was all worked up about. But I came to understand that people who are, in a very, very ironic way, using the word against Jews have taken it a little bit too literally. The anti-Semites who invented the word anti-Semitism, antisemitismus, were Germans. The most notable among them, a man named Wilhelm Marr. In their creation of the caste or the race of Jews, they assigned us the race of the Semite, the dirty, disgusting Semite. All the stereotypes that the Germans could apply. And in sort of an oppositional way, they assigned Aryan to themselves. Now, neither of those are races, not that race is a real thing. Race is a cultural construct, but we can speak about race as being something that, at least in the minds of people, exists. But Semite was never one of those things, except in Germany. And so he regarded himself as anti-Semitismus, anti-Semitic. The problem with that, of course, is that later on, people who are anti-Semitic, and I think you can imagine who I'm talking about, and I just recently came across it on social media in vast gobs that my children share with me, will use that to say, how can Arabs, for instance, Palestinians, for instance, and so forth, be anti-Semitic when they are Semites too? They're not Semites, and we're not Semites. Semitic is a language group. Sometimes when we're talking about ancient people, we will refer to the Semitic peoples, but we mean the peoples who spoke Semitic languages. And to call us, to say it's impossible for them to be anti-Semitic. I even saw one post recently, maybe yesterday, that said that the Jews in Israel were not Semites at all. So how could anybody be anti-Semitic against Jews? Well, I don't care what you call it, but it is Jew hatred, no matter how it's spelled. And by lowering the capital letter, which is important both in German and in English, and getting rid of the dash, and people have different approaches to the A, like they do to capitalizing the word black or the word white and so forth. You get rid of that. And we're stuck, of course, with the invention of an anti-Semite for what we're supposed to call ourselves. But even this, and it's just this sort of insidious irony, is something that we have to deal with when we're talking about our very long history of being a people that is despised. So what I want to do next now is just remind you that we're going to be taking a long journey through a lot of places. So this is a long class and not a particularly always pleasant experience. It's a long class that's going to take us today into antiquity, pagan antiquity, primarily Hellenistic, North African, Egyptian anti-Semitism that developed as early as 300 BCE, as far as we can tell, into Christendom, which has an enormous history of it that we'll try to understand both from a theological and from a, I suppose, a racialized point of view, because it did become racialized, in which we'll take a look at medieval anti-Semitism, how it manifested itself in various different countries, how it was handled by the church and so forth. All the way through Enlightenment, Emancipation. I should have mentioned also the Islamic world, because it did happen there. The Enlightenment, the Emancipation, right through the Dreyfus Affair, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, up until a day before yesterday and this morning. So we have plenty to look at. Now, some of these texts are things you've heard of, and many of them are things you haven't heard of. But I want to dive right in. I'm scrolling right now down to my primary notes, so just give me a moment. And maybe it's worth, I think, just one more very quick mention that the trying to identify the beginning of this so-called world's oldest hatred, and I don't know if it's the world's oldest hatred. I do know it's one of the world's longest running hatreds. It's a Broadway show that we didn't want to be part of, and that we have now been cast in for a very, very long time. So as we're taking a look at this, we try to go back and see where is evidence of it. So you might have heard recently that Benjamin Netanyahu, ill-advisedly, and also, by the way, wrongly, said that the Palestinians are like Amalek. This is a people in the Torah narrative that six themselves on the Israelites as they're wandering through the wilderness, and it becomes very clear in that narrative that they're just bloodthirsty for Israelites. They just want to kill all the Israelites. But Jewish tradition later ascribed them a role only in being the ancestors of a very few people who were really just bloodthirsty for Jews, but who also should be wiped off the face of the earth, and that hated us for no reason. And that's the main thing there. To refer to Palestinians as Amalek is to essentially say that the Torah approves the death of every one of them, because it actually says in the Torah you should blot them out. It also says you should remember them. You should always remember them and also blot out their name, which is, of course, a very interesting kind of contradiction. I don't know how you do both. But it is true that Jewish tradition ascribes Amalek roots to Haman, for example. Haman is considered an Amalekite. An Agagite is how he's identified, but the rabbis traced the Agagites back to the Amalekites. But does that mean the Book of Esther is talking about a real anti-Semitism? Probably not. It doesn't seem to have been widespread back then. These were cosmopolitan cultures in which Jews seemed to feel very comfortable. Now, there were weird things that Jews did. And as we go through some of these texts, we'll consider them. They don't seem weird today, but they seemed weird back then. One of them, I'll just mention it right now, is the fact that we only worship one God. That seemed very narrow to most people. But what seemed even weirder is that God was invisible and had is depictability a word? No manner of depiction, no desire that the Jews had to depict him. In fact, it was forbidden over time to depict Yahweh. So that was weird to them. And there were other practices, of course, that were weird because we have a lot of sort of very narrow ways of doing things, that we eat, how we dress, and so forth. And that was as true back then as it was up until the Enlightenment, the Emancipation, when Jews really had very distinct ways, sometimes imposed upon them and sometimes adopted themselves. Is the book of Hanukkah about anti-Semitism? No. The book of Hanukkah is about a civil war between different kinds of Jews, whom we can talk about again next December, because by the time January arrives, it's the last thing I want to talk about again, since I almost never stop talking about it during those weeks. But no, it doesn't represent anti-Semitism. Were the Romans anti-Semitic? We know that that our ancestors fought two wars against the Romans, two very bloody wars that both resulted in expulsion. One was the so-called Jewish Wars of 66 through 70 CE. It was that war that gave us the fellow whose book we're going to read today a little bit from, Josephus. He was a failed military commander up in the northern part of Israel at a place called Gamla in the Galilee. And after he was a fierce warrior, but which I guess gained him the respect of the Romans. But after he surrendered, he was taken on by the Romans to keep a journal, essentially, to be the reporter of the events of the Jewish war for the, I guess, Jewish posterity. But he was also a great defender of his people. Didn't take away his love for his people. He wrote in Greek, and we have his works. They've been published. You can go into Barnes and Noble and buy them. They're almost always in every bookstore, even popular bookstores. But we don't know if you can characterize the war against Rome as being a war against anti-Semitism. Rome, which this is often forgotten, was invited to occupy the land of Israel, Judea, the kingdom of the Maccabees, the failed kingdom of the Maccabees. They were invited to come in and to impose their Pax Romana. So it's very unclear. Certainly later in the Second War, which was known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, some of you have taken some history classes with Natan may remember this one. It was actually a much worse war, and there were all kinds of horrible restrictions that were placed on the Jews and the rabbis in particular. And it really was, I would say, almost a genocidal kind of war. They wanted to eliminate the Jews, but I don't think it's because they hated Jews per se. I don't think this was a unique hatred of any kind. I think that this was a very problematic people who were kind of ruining their occupation of the land, a land that had it taken the style of the more Hellenistic Maccabees a couple hundred years earlier, might have been a little bit more open and cosmopolitan. It might have also been less Jewish. It's difficult to say. All right, so what we're going to do is hear from the people who we can at least, I think, say are the original anti-Semites. Now, as we do this, I want to ask you all to think about some, and this is we're going to return to these throughout the entire course. Let me first put it that way. I want you to think about some elements of anti-Semitic discourse that appear throughout history. Now, they come in different kinds of phases, different ways of looking at them. And they are often very specific to one way of demonizing Jews versus another. But I just want you to sort of keep these in front of your brain a little bit. So if you're taking notes, you could just write down the headlines on them. We won't see all of them all the time, but we will return to this list quite frequently. So here's some elements of anti-Semitic discourse that seem to have some life of their own that allows them to find new ways to be fed as they're directed at Jews. One is demonization. So demonization, which of course as you would probably expect, we're going to see more with Christian anti-Semitism, which is, I have to say, the lion's share of anti-Semitism has come out of the Christian world. Not all of it, of course, not by far, but the lion's share has. So demonization, we'll see a little bit of too in these pre-Christian texts we're going to look at. The idea of deicide. Even Greeks who were not Christian, pre-Christian, could think of that. And I'm sure everybody's very, very much aware that deicide was a central part, and continues to be for some, of the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews, particularly in the world of religious Christians for a very, very long time. Ritual slaughter, meaning not that the Jews ritually slaughter their cows or that kind of thing, but that they use people's blood or purposely seek to harm people, that they kidnap children, etc. Another idea that began to already, I think, spread throughout the world. I'm trying to think of a different way to say it, because the idea is the wandering Jew. Jews very much became what the Yiddish speakers used to call Luftmenschen. We were often on the road. And we were often on the road for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was because we needed to get out, and sometimes it was because we wanted to get out. Usually it was more the former than the latter. So that's something. The wandering Jew specifically refers to something in Christian civilization, but that there is, I think, still a good umbrella even for depictions of the Jews kind of infiltrating societies throughout history and creating all kinds of problems. Another one is carnality, the over-sexualization of Jews that's frequently depicted. The poisoning of people. We will see this particularly in medieval Europe, because the more people who die from unnatural causes, the more likely it is that the one minority, or the one minority that has any real presence there, is going to be selected as the source. But you'll also see weird things that you may not even be able to conjure up in your imagination. In Christendom, they created this idea of what's called host desecration. Wait till I get to that one. Dirt and disease. The Jews are physically defective, deformed, that they carry diseases just that are innate to them. You've heard, of course, we've all heard the the idea of a dirty Jew and so forth, the Jewish odor. You see it everywhere in literature and in depictions of Jews throughout any place that hates Jews. And then finally, is this finally? No, it's not finally. I got three more. Money and criminality and control. That will come out very significantly. Global conspiracy, I think it's somewhat related. And finally, and also related in some ways to some of the other things we've seen, a bestialization. It's related somewhat to demonization. Being compared to pigs, being compared to disgusting animals. This is one that happens to come up very frequently in Muslim anti-Semitism, Jews being depicted as pigs. But you also found it in German anti-Semitism, the Judensau. And it's even depicted on the frescoes of churches. Yes, at some point, and we're going to actually look at anti-Semitism carved into the statues and the entire statuary of Christian churches. It's quite a thing to see, and I've got a lot of examples of it. All right, so let's go to trying to figure out what did I do with the PDF. Let's go to our first text. I guess I'm just going to share this from Word. I thought I had made a PDF about it, and I apologize that I haven't. What happened to it? All right, just give me 2 seconds here to do the screen share, because I got a lot going on my screen. And that is the only thing that I have to say. They've never really improved with this app, but you should be able to see it now, yes? All right, we're going to start in Antiquity. And what we're going to do is we're going to meet two guys who have been preserved for us by one guy. The one guy you've already met is Josephus. And the two guys are named Manetho, and the other one is Apion. Both of them lived in Alexandria in northern Africa. And I have to apologize to you. I now, having shared my screen, I see very few of you on my screen. So if you have something, maybe Arthur, you see people more than I do, or you can just cut in. Anybody can unmute themselves, but it's a pretty big class, and so I don't have the capacity to see everybody at once. I'm getting like just 3 or 4 of you. In any case, both Manetho and this fella Apion, I'll tell you just a bit about them in a moment. They apparently wrote books with all kinds of slanders against the Jews. We don't have those books anymore, but we have Josephus's books. I think we have everything Josephus wrote, to tell you the truth. We have Josephus's book, and Josephus, being the perhaps not great military figure, but definitely a fantastically motivated defender of the Jews, addressed the things that they said in his books and quoted from them quite liberally. So this is a good place for us to start. If indeed this is when it starts, I think we can claim very easily 23 centuries of anti-Semitism, because the work published by Manetho, we know when he lived around 300 BCE. He was an Egyptian priest. He wrote, importantly, a history of Egypt in Greek. And now I'm talking about a history of ancient Egypt in Greek, all the way up through his own times. And those works are still used today to look at the various dynasties and so forth, because we don't we no longer possess a lot of the original texts. We didn't possess any of the text before the translation was made available, but now we have that. So these fragments that we do have of what he wrote are very much used still by by scholars, but we're not interested in that. What we're interested in is what he said about the Jews. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of it, and then we're going to move on to Apion, because Josephus addresses Apion slanders much more thoroughly. So to give you a flavor of it, Manetho turns the story, and this is common, he turns the story of the Jews on its head, upside down. Now, why am I saying that this is so important for us to be aware of? It happens even now. One of the great anti-Semitic, I would say, collections of diatribes that's going around at this moment has to do with disconnecting the Jews from our own history. I saw very briefly that Jamie, I think you posted something about the Khazars. Later on, we're going to learn about the Khazarian myth, that the Jews are not Jews, that we're not the people of the Bible, that we have no relationship or relation at all to the people of the Bible, that we are just a bunch of white people from the Caucasian mountains who adopted that for ourselves, co-opted it, and then sometime around 1890, 1900, used our whiteness to go, and this is the latest canard, to go into Palestine, because Israel didn't really exist, it was Palestine, and steal the land. Well, this is a very modern example of what Manetho did. Manetho knew our history because our history was written down. And by the year 300, the Torah and much of the rest of the Bible was accessible to people. There were already appearing translations in Aramaic, now a little bit after his time, but these works were available to him. And he views the history of the Jews, as will Apion, in a very, very different way than we learn it in our Torah. So let's look at his introduction as quoted by Josephus, and then we're going to move on to what Josephus himself says, quoting and then in response, giving his own answers to Apion, and I'll tell you who he was in a moment. So this is from Manethus's book, is quoted by Josephus. There was a king of ours whose name was Timaeus. I don't know who that's supposed to be, presumably Ramses. Under him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us. Now he's writing as an Egyptian. Keep in mind, though, he is a Hellenized Egyptian. He's a Ptolemy. This is not ancient Egypt of the Ten Commandments movie. These are the Hellenized people of Cleopatra type, that kind of Egyptian, although obviously she's later. And there came, after a surprising, not my misspelling, that comes from the translation, after a surprising manner, men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, meaning they came over here to Egypt from the east, and had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with ease subdued it by force. So if you want to look for the accusation of the Jews being colonial settlers, it's in the very first paragraph of the very first anti-Semitic work known to humanity. That just occurred to me as I was reading it. Yet without our hazarding a battle with them. So when they had gotten those that governed us under their power, they afterwards burnt down our cities and demolished the temples of the gods and used all the inhabitants after a most barbarous manner. Nay, some they slew and led their children and their wives into slavery. At length they made one of themselves king, whose name was Tacitus. Now, what are they talking about here? What is he talking about? Is this without any historical support whatsoever? Well, it's actually with enough historical support that even into, I would say about 50 or 60 years ago, a version of this story was thought to be the real historical narrative for how the Jews got into Egypt and into trouble in Egypt for centuries of hard labor in the book of Genesis. There was a real invasion of a Semitic language group, people known as the Hyksos, that somehow entered in and did take over parts of Egypt. For a long time, that story was believed to have been the narrative behind Joseph, he of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and the wonderful musical, which I love. But more importantly, of the Torah narrative. Then there's more than one that are sewn together. The timing never worked out. Archaeologists, I would say by about 50, 60, 70 years ago, for sure, had erased any connection between the Hyksos and the Israelites. But he does not. As far as he's concerned, the Hyksos were the Israelites, and they came in boldly colonizing the land of Egypt. And this brings us now, so you understand the beginnings of it and how this thing happens. This brings us now to Josephus in book 2 of the Against Apion, Apion. I don't know how you pronounce that. I don't speak ancient Greek. Now, who was Apion? Very briefly, he was a Greek grammarian. He was well known. He was a sophist. He lived in Alexandria. He was especially well known for his bitter hatred of the Jews. He probably died in Rome around 45, 46 CE. So this is a man who lived just prior to the Jewish wars and was Egyptian. So now here's Josephus. Although I confess I've had doubt upon me about Apion, the grammarian, whether I ought to take the trouble of confuting him or not, for some of his writings contain much the same accusations which the others have laid against us, and here I believe he's referring to Manetho. Some things that he has added are very frigid and contemptible. Only the more old-fashioned translation of Josephus is available for me to cut and paste from computers, but I think you guys are catching on. Yet does he seem, amidst a great confusion and disorder in his falsehoods, to produce in the first place such things as resemble what we have examined already in the Manetho section and relate to the departure of our forefathers out of Egypt. And in the second place, he accuses those Jews that are inhabitants of Alexandria. Now, this was a problem because there was Jew hatred in Alexandria. And Alexandria seems to have been the first place in which uprisings and pogroms of Jews, if you can use that word, it's a little bit historical, but I think it counts. It's the first place we have recorded uprisings of Jews against the Egyptians. And again, we're talking about Hellenistic Egyptians, and vice versa. Persecutions of Jews by Alexandrians, who were quite a cosmopolitan group, but Jews somehow just did not fit in. As in the third place, he mixes with those things such accusations as concern the sacred purifications and the other legal rites used in the temple, meaning his temple, the Jewish temple, which was still standing when Josephus wrote this. He then assigns a certain wonderful and plausible occasion for the name of Shabbat. So now we're going to get what the guy is talking about because we don't have his text. For he says that when the Jews had traveled a 6 days journey, now this is, remember, the anti-Semitic Apion's version of what happened with the Jews. They had traveled a 6 days journey out of Egypt. No, nothing about being freed or being slaves or anything like that. They were oppressors who had somehow finally been forced out. They had buboes in their groins. I hope you know what that means, right? Like bubonic plague. They had horrible, disgusting disease in their groins. And notice how in the list that I gave you, dirty, filthy Jews appears right here 2,000 years ago as a canard against the Jews. So they had buboes in their groins, and that on this account, it was that they rested on the 7th day. No, Shabbat was not a gift from God, as the Jewish Bible tells them. It's because they got a 6-day illness of buboes. And they therefore needed to rest on the 7th day. And they commemorated that every week. Their disgusting, diseased bodies commemorated by the ongoing Shabbat. It gets worse. On this, as having gotten safely to, all right, the rest of the seventh day, as having gotten safely to that country, which is now called Judea, by the way, Judea, that then they preserved the language of the Egyptians and called that day the Sabbath, Shabbat. For that malady of buboes on their groin was called by the Egyptians sabbatosis. It is a most shameful thing for free men to forge lies on any occasion. This is again Josephus's words, and much more so to forge them about our temple, which was so famous over all the world and was preserved so sacred by us. And by the way, he is living at the moment when the temple in Jerusalem is at its grandest. If you've ever seen the Herodian temple, that is the grandest that the temple ever was. The Western Wall is the remains of the retaining wall that helped to prop up the incredible platform that's up there. It used to go, actually, it was actually, the ground level was much lower, but the wall is still there. So he's now going to defend the temple. For Apion hath the impudence to pretend that the Jews placed an ass's head in their holy place. Once again, associating Jews 2,000 years ago now with animals that are considered unclean. And he affirms that this was discovered, supposedly, when Antiochus Epiphanes, that's the Maccabean villain in our story, spoiled our temple and found that ass's head there made of gold and worth a great deal of money. And here you have the Jewish avarice. We've barely gotten into 10 minutes of anti-Semitism in the world. And between Manetho 2,300 years ago and Apion some 2,000 years ago, we've already identified 2 or 3 of the characteristics of anti-Semitism that are going to grow and mutate like cancers aimed at us in some of the most bizarre ways. Apion also tells a false story when he mentions an oath of ours as if we swore by God, the maker of heaven and earth and sea, to bear no goodwill to any foreigner. We hate all outsiders. This, of course, speaks to our unusual customs. And it's true, it has been difficult and a challenge to modern Jews that was first really unveiled by the emancipation for us to do certain things with non-Jews. Business on Shabbat. There were questions about that the rabbis had about later on, I'm talking about now in medieval times and earlier too, about whether or not Christians, mostly, not Muslims, were pagans and what kinds of businesses and business they could do with them and so forth. But mostly it was the eating problem. Kashrut, keeping kosher, was a problem. And they viewed us as being clannish and being disdainful, is that a word, of outsiders. And particularly, he says, to none of the Greeks. On the contrary, it had so happened that many of them have come over to our laws, and some of them have continued in their observance. Nor did anybody ever hear this oath sworn by us that we reject outsiders. Apion, it seemed, was the only person that heard it, for he indeed was the first composer of it. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but he's certainly the first one that we have that that obviously secondhand has any kind of a connection. So this treatise that Apion composed, it seems to have been rather lengthy because this book goes on and on and on. But, you know, if you're going to excerpt from it, you got to go with the Bubos and the Sabbath because that's the best part, or the most disgusting part. You decide. And this man was not without influence. He was the official delegate to the emperor for the Alexandrian community. And that gave him power and probably had a great deal to do with his ability to wind up the Alexandrians against the Jews. He had even worked for Jews to lose their rights as Roman citizens. There were Roman citizens who were Jewish. The riots that I mentioned took place over 3-4 years in 38 to 41 CE, and the Jewish quarter of the city of Alexandria was burned to the ground. Among the other kinds of things that he that he spread around. We already got the leprosy thing, the bubos, and the head of the ass that they worship, but that Jews were not only misanthropes but performed human sacrifice. So there's blood libel, something that will continue for 2,300 years. That's continuing today. That circumcision demonstrated how much they simply stole from other cultures. Egyptians circumcised. And he goes on and on and on. We would not know about a lot of these different kinds of anti-Semitism if it were not for him. And sadly, we know now a good deal, and I've only presented you with the tip of the iceberg, because I want to move on to the next one before we get to Christianity, which may be a little bit at the end of today and certainly next week. We're going to spend a lot of time in Christianity because Christianity is the source of much Jew hatred. All right, so we're going to talk about now a different writer, also this guy, a Roman, named Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus, sometimes called Publius. I am no expert in these people. I know I saw Ron Aronson. He probably is much more familiar with many of these folks than I am. But I do know what I can read, which is that he was a senator and historian, and he is known to have been a very important historian. He's one of the first. He's probably the greatest of Roman historians. He lived in what was called the Silver Age of Latin literature, and he did not write in Greek. He wrote in Latin, so this is our first exposure to that. He's known for the brevity and compactness of his prose, which is still studied, and very, very much studied for his analysis of politics and warfare and so forth. There are two major works that survived of his that examine the reigns of people we've heard of, people that were part of Jewish history at that time too, Tiberius notably, but also Claudius and Nero, and others who can watch on PBS specials. So, like Josephus, he is recording the history of the Jewish war, where we pick up with him. And before doing that, before talking about how the Romans in the year 70 performed the siege of Jerusalem that ultimately resulted in the downfall of the kingdom and of the temple, the kingdom was already gone, but the temple, he gives us a little bit of history of the Jews. And it's kind of a cockamamie history, so we're going to read it a little bit together and talk about it. The Jews were said to have been refugees from the island of Crete, who settled in the remotest corner of Libya in the days when, according to the story, Saturn was driven from his throne by the aggression of Jupiter. This is followed, he says, by other accounts. Well, this is you should know. But look what he's doing right now. He's again invoking the idea of the wandering Jew. I mean, we have not dipped our toe in anti-Semitic history yet, when we are already seeing now at least 5 different components of anti-Semitism, about which all I really told you was just the headlines. So when we talk about people having nascent anti-Semitism or inbred anti-Semitism or whatever you want to call it, it's because world culture has been filled with this for a very, very long time. And as you know, it got greater and greater. It expanded like gas. He goes on to say, most authorities, however, agree on the following account. The whole of Egypt was once plagued by a wasting disease that caused bodily disfigurement. I wonder who caused that. So Pharaoh Bacchorus went to the oracle of Hammon to ask for a cure and was told to purify his kingdom by expelling the victims to other lands. Who are these victims? These people from Libya, suddenly were from Libya, who brought it with them. Because why? They lay under a divine curse. Thus a multitude of sufferers was rounded up, herded together, and abandoned in the wilderness. Here the exiles tearfully resigned themselves to their fate. But one of them, who was called Moses, urged his companions not to wait passively for help from gods or man, for both had deserted them. They should trust to their own initiative and to whatever guidance first helped them to extricate themselves from their present plight. They agreed and started off at random into the unknown, but exhaustion set in, chiefly through lack of water. and the level plain was already strewn with the bodies of those who had collapsed and were at their last gasp when a herd of wild asses left their pasture and made for the spade of a wooded crag. Moses followed them and was able to bring to light a number of abundant channels of water, whose presence he had deduced from a grassy patch of ground. This relieved their thirst. They traveled on for 6 days without a break. And on the seventh, they expelled the previous inhabitants of Canaan, took over their lands, and in them built a holy city and temple. This could have been on Instagram yesterday. This is what I'm reading right now. In the year, what year are we in? Is it 48 CE? Unbelievable how these things repeat themselves. Not only were the Jews or the Israelites or whatever they didn't call them from a land far away, but they are always from a place where they are usurping another place. They are always stealing or attempting to steal and bringing plague and harassment with them. This is the narrative right now, by the way, of Hamas and of many of these so-called well-meaning people online who have made pronouncements about who we are and where we come from. And I'm not speaking about whether or not the Palestinians have a place there. That's undeniable. Of course they do. History marches on. But when Jews are assigned an outsider status in our own ancient homeland, do not believe that this is new, that this is something novel that they just came up with. This is something that people have been saying for generation upon generation, thousands of years. It is not just a little phrase to say the world's oldest hatred or the world's longest running hatred, as I usually prefer. Here they're depicted so far by three of the only three that are preserved. They all have this in common. And we must believe that there were others too. In order to secure the allegiance of his people in the future, Moses prescribed for them a novel religion quite different from those of the rest of mankind. Now remember, this is pre-Christian. So this is not going to have the same kind of anti-Jewish, and now I mean anti-Judaism, anti-the religion markers, but you'll still see quite a similarity to what Christians and others said. Among the Jews, all things are profane that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they regard as permissible what seems to us immoral. In the innermost part of their temple, they consecrated an image of the animal which had delivered them from their wandering and thirst. Once again, we have, what were those donkeys? And then they chose a ram as beast of sacrifice to demonstrate, so it seems, their contempt for Hamun. This is an Egyptian god. The bull is also offered up because the Egyptians worship it as Apis. The bull was one of the manifestations of an Egyptian god called Ptah. They avoid eating pork in memory of their tribulations, as they themselves were once infected with the disease to which the creature is subject. So we don't eat pork because, and you always heard it, right, from your grandparents, oh, it's dirty, which, by the way, is probably not the reason we don't eat pork, or the Jews decided not to eat pork. But nevertheless, here it's said because they're held up in some ways as holy. We don't eat them in gratitude because we are like the pig. I'm telling you, you're going to see this over and over and over again. This never disappears. This association with dirty or problematic animals. It never disappears. They still fast frequently as an admission of the hunger they once endured so long, and to symbolize their hurried meal, the bread eaten by the Jews is unleavened. At least he got one thing right. We are told that the seventh day was set aside for rest because this marked the end of their toils. In course of time, the seductions of idleness made them devote every seventh year to indolence as well. This is another ongoing claim about the Jews, that we're lazy. Now, when the Christians too had Sabbaths, it became about our holidays, because we do have quite a few holidays. But indolence and laziness is an ongoing theme as well. Others say that this is a mark of respect to Saturn, either because they owe the basic principles of their religion to Idai, don't ask me, who we are told was expelled in the company of Saturn and became the founder of the Jewish race, or because among the 7 stars that rule mankind, the one that describes the highest orbit and exerts the greatest influence is Saturn. So we worship animals and supposedly Saturn as well. A further argument is that most of the heavenly bodies complete their paths and revolutions in multiples of 7. Whatever their origin, these observances are sanctioned by their antiquity. The other practices of the Jews are sinister and revolting and have entrenched themselves by their very wickedness. Wretches of the most abandoned kind who had no use for the religion of their fathers took to contributing dues and free will offerings to swell the Jewish exchequer, the treasury. And other reasons for their increasing wealth may be found in their stubborn loyalty and ready benevolence toward brother Jews. This is the clannishness. 2,000 years old. This could have come right out of Hitler's mouth. But the rest of the world they confront with hatred reserved for enemies. They will not feed or intermarry with Gentiles. Well, that was true. The most lascivious people, that's the carnality I spoke of. So what are we up to now? 6 or 7 of the 10 things? The Jews avoid sexual intercourse with women of alien race. Among themselves, nothing is barred. They have introduced the practice of circumcision to show that they are different from others. Proselytes to Jewry adopt the same practices. And the very first lesson they learn is to despise the gods, meaning the Egyptian, the Greek, and really you're talking about the Greek gods, the Greek and Roman gods. Shed all feelings of patriotism, dual loyalty, very, very common canard, right up to this very day, and consider parents, children, and brothers as readily expendable. However, the Jews see to it that their numbers increase. It is a deadly sin to kill an unwanted child, and they think that eternal life is granted to those who die in battle or execution, hence their eagerness to have children and their contempt for death. That was probably not true, but that's something that's wielded against a lot of peoples. So this summation of the history we find in Tacitus, the great historian of the Romans, mirrors so much of what we're going to see going forward. In addition to everything else we talked about, what did we see here? We're indolent and lazy, so we're like beggars. The dual loyalties, the aggressiveness in proselytizing, there was a lot of that going on. Now, the hour is getting a little bit late, but there's a lot to talk about after this. We don't know, other than the uprisings and the fights that Jews had in a variety of places, Rome certainly, Alexandria definitely, and other parts of the Roman world. We don't know exactly what the numbers were of people, but all 3 of these fellas living over the course of 400 years and just happening to be people that were, in one case, preserved because he was so important. Another addressed, at least, because he was considered so important. That would be Apion. And Manetho, who was a very important Egyptian priest. They are clearly not just speaking for themselves. These are the people who were literate, who could write this down, who chose to use their space in what they were writing about to say these things about the Jews. And it's very true that we were quite different in many ways from lots of peoples. But what made them feel this way? You could get a PhD in anti-Semitism, you could get a PhD in racism, and you may not still understand it. All we can know is that peoples needed outsiders to direct their hate against. And we seem to be very convenient in most places. Later on, we won't be quite the target everywhere that we were back then, but we still never cease to have it lobbed against us. One after the other, continuously renewed because of our beliefs, because of our appearances, just because they don't like our stories, because we seem this way or we seem that way. All right, so what I want to do now is make a little transition, and I will promise you we're going to repeat it next week. because we're going to go into an area of history that is much, much better understood. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the form of anti-Semitism. I think I can close this because I'm not going to be sharing a text right now, so I can maybe see everybody a little bit better. We're going to be talking about Christianity at some length. And because of that, I think it's important for us to understand that this, unlike some of the other manifestations that we've seen, the Latin, Roman version, the North African version twice, this is really where a lot of those ideas feed into. And it's the beginning of Christianity. And part of this is because Christianity and Judaism start out as siblings. So this becomes as much a sibling rivalry that feeds off of anti-Semitic imagery and beliefs that were pre-existent as it does as anything else. However, it's important for us to understand and talk just a very, very little bit about the history of Christianity and where it originated from in Judaism, because it was only one generation, maybe 1.5 generations, if you want to be generous, of Jews who were also Christians. And very quickly, the Christians who weren't Jews began to outnumber the Jews who were Christians. Even to say that there were Jews who were Christians is to sort of, it's really to mischaracterize what they were. They were not theologically Paulian type of Christians that we have today. Almost all Christians today, whether they're on the liberal side or the more conservative side, are some form, not all of them, but almost all of them, are some form of Paulian Christianity. Which has to do with the nature of sin and the purpose of the law and the purpose of the Christ and so forth. There were lots and lots and lots of varieties of Christianity among Gentiles long before this. But they were all declared heresies and they disappeared. There were just, I mean, you can go to the religion section of, again, Barnes and Noble, and you'll find lots of these things that ultimately became heresies. And even with the Protestant Reformation and everything else, and all of the differences that you find among Eastern and Western and Roman and Protestant versions and the liberal and the not so liberal, you're going to find that they all have this common ancestor in Paulian theology. So it's just where it goes back to. Now, going back another step, there is a moment in time when people who really should not be called Christians, because it kind of erases who they really were, but when there were Jews who were Christians. And even though Paul was Jewish, he's not one of the ones I'm talking about. And in fact, you can read the New Testament, especially the early history of the church that's located in the located in the New Testament, and you'll see the disputes that they had and how they worked out. And so at the very, very beginning, a lot of this was just theological goings forth, back and forth. Later, though, remember, and it only takes a few hundred years, not even a couple, the Christendom grows and grows and grows, and Jews do not, because we're not the ones in power. And so it becomes much more serious. Some things that started as just arguments between us. I'll give you an example. And then we'll return to this next week and talk about it in some depth. So you've heard the word Pharisee all your life, right? Right? Shake your head if you know what a Pharisee was. But probably growing up hearing the word Pharisee, you did not know that the Pharisees were our rabbis. How many of you knew that the Pharisees were our rabbis? Very, very few of you. The way that they are depicted in the New Testament represents the very strong theological divide that very quickly developed between the Jewish Jews and the Christian Gentiles. They began arguing right away because essentially our religion was being used to create a new religion. Christianity is in so many ways the daughter religion or the sibling religion of Judaism. The daughter is probably better, or son, because he is the son. But it also has lots of roots in things that are simply not all that, or were not all that interesting to Jews. And so when Jews began arguing, rabbinical Jews began arguing with Christians, those arguments found their way into the New Testament. And our rabbis, who were called in Hebrew prushim, become Pharisees. You could even hear the similarity in the words. And the Pharisees become sort of the baddies, not as bad as other Jews in the story. I often suggest to people that if you want to really know the true story of Jesus and the Jews, the best movie to watch is called The Life of Brian. And I know it's one of the funniest, it's a complete satire. Now, my professors of Christianity and Christian thought would have said that it was The Passion of Christ, the one that came out in which one was it? The one that came out in the 80s. Not Mel Gibson's movie, the other one that came out in the 80s that the church didn't like. I think I get the name wrong. But Life of Brian is good enough for me, because you see how there was an environment that had very little to do with sin or the fall of man or the need for a redemptive Greek style, Hellenistic style Messiah, and really had everything to do with what Jews were dealing with, which was Roman occupation and increasing oppression by Romans. And as a result of that, looking beyond the politics of the day to an eschatological solution of their problem, an end of days series of events that they imagined that would bring the Jews back to power in the world. The Mashiach, Messiah, the Mashiach to the Jews is an anointed king descended from King David, who will lead us back to glory. He still is, as far as Jews who believe in this kind of thing go. But at some point, he became something different, the Jesus version here. He became something very different. And while there were two factions who kind of sort of accepted each other's different points of view, that wasn't going to last long, because Jesus's brother, who led that little gang of I guess you could call them Jewish Christians. I would call them the Jesus movement. These folks, after a generation had gone by and no Jesus had come back, well, they were sort of like those Chabadniks who thought the Rebbe was the Messiah. There's still a few of them running around. They built that tunnel, right? There's still a few of them, but they're considered cranks now. And I guarantee they'll be gone in a half a generation. They never took hold. And that's what this was about. This was those people who thought that Jesus was the guy, but he didn't come back. He wasn't the guy. The resurrection thing, by the way, not so abnormal. Jews always believed in the rabbinical era that people were going to be resurrected at the end of time. The New Testament preserves that, by the way. Jesus is not the only guy who gets resurrected. Look at the New Testament. I'm going to say the wrong gospel, because I always say the wrong gospel. But at least one of the gospels has graves opening up everywhere. Remind me to look that one up so I can tell you about that. Graves are opening up everywhere on that day. If you remember the end of Ben-Hur, that's that day, the day of the resurrection and the splitting of the curtain in the temple and so forth. So, these Jews, they were basically looking for a Jewish Messiah, a king, and good old Jesus didn't have it in him. So for the first generation, they start communicating with this guy, Saul, he says. I don't believe for a minute he was really ever named Saul. He was a completely Hellenized Jew. He didn't live anywhere near Israel. The stories of him having studied in Israel and so forth in the temple are simply fiction. And this guy's got a whole different take on Jesus. He is not the kind of Jew who's looking for the king. He's the kind of Jew who thinks that, well, he thinks like a lot of Hellenistic people do, that the world is corrupt, the body is corrupt, the spirit is corrupt, it's all corrupt. If you read Philo, who was a Jewish interpreter of the Torah, who lived in Alexandria before Jesus, you'll see that a lot of Jews who lived in Hellenistic environments had these kinds of weird, for us, weird philosophical issues and theological issues that were not all that Jewish, or at least not all that Eretz Yisrael or Babylon Jewish, which is where the majority of Jews still lived at that time and would for quite a while. Not so much in Israel after a couple hundred years, but in Babylon for sure. And so they were dealing with a Jesus that was just like the Rebbe. He's the Mashiach until he's not. And if he dies, he's really not. All right, maybe he'll come back tomorrow. Oh, he didn't. All right, maybe next year he didn't. All right, are you getting tired of this? Yeah, I'm getting tired of this too. And meanwhile, they're arguing with Paul. And Paul has decided, these Jews don't understand what I'm talking about at all here. They think the Mashiach is supposed to do this. It's not. The Mashiach is more like the Christos that we here in the Greek world want to purify our souls and our persons through our faith in him. And they're arguing, and finally the two just give up on each other. The Jews go back to being Jews in a generation and a half, and then the Gentiles take over. And it's when the Gentiles take over that their adoption of both our book, when they like it, and us as the villain of our own book, the failures, and their success, the new Israel, with the New Testament, a new covenant, it becomes more and more important for them to plug into anti-Judaism, which inevitably becomes anti-Jew. And that's where we're going to go next time. We're going to start reading the book, some excerpts from the books of the Gospels, and we'll start to understand how those people who were, the first guy was the tail end of these Jews. There may have been one, possibly two who were Jewish, but the third and the fourth absolutely were not. And I don't think the second was either. And none of them were writing in Hebrew, and none of them were all that connected to Judaism. And the further they get away and the more it becomes a Gentile enterprise, the more it becomes an anti-Jew enterprise. First anti-Judaism and then anti-Jewish personage. And the two become, we used to argue, is this anti-Judaism or is this anti-Semitism? Well, there comes a point where they just all mix together in the same vile stew. So that's where we're going to go next week, to that horrible place. But also fascinating too. And for those who are interested in theology, which is a completely made up science, having no basis in anything but the imagination, but boy, can I take a hold on it. I think you'll find this stuff fascinating too. All right, everybody, thank you for joining me. We are on for all the Mondays. There are no Mondays that I'm going to be away. So, all right, everybody, take care. Thank you.